Hello students, welcome back to the English Danny channel. I'm teacher Sarah. Today we're going to take a look at adverbs of frequency. Let's get started. Before we begin talking about adverbs of frequency, let's go ahead and take a moment to review what is an adverb. An adverb is a word that's used to modify or describe or tell more about verbs, adjectives, and even other adverbs. Let's take a look at a couple examples. Here is a simple sentence, I run. Here we see our verb is run. Now we could add an adverb into this sentence to give us more information about our verb run. For example, I slowly run. As you can see, the adverb here tells us more about that verb run. Now let's take a look at how an adverb can be used with an adjective. Here is a sentence. I'm happy. Here we see our adjective is happy. Now I'm going to add an adverb to give us more information about that adjective. For example, I'm extremely happy. Here, the adverb extremely gives us more information about that adjective, happy. Okay, now let's take a look at adverbs of frequency. What are they? Adverbs of frequency are used to talk about how often something happens, and often are used in response to the question, how often? Adverbs of frequency are used often to talk about things like habits, hobbies, and regular occurrences. Some of the adverbs of frequency we'll talk about today are always, normally, usually, often, sometimes, rarely, seldom, and never. Now, these are not all of the adverbs of frequency there are, but we will use these 8 as examples for how to use adverbs of frequency in different kinds of sentences. Let's take a look at what these words mean. Here, if we look at the top of this chart, we can see that always means 100%. It is always true 100% of the time. For example, I always eat breakfast. This means that every day, always, 100% of the time, I eat breakfast. I always eat breakfast. Now let's go down to our next word, normally. Normally means something happens about 90% of the time. For example, I normally go to bed at 11 o'clock. This means that about 90% of the time I go to bed at 11 o'clock. And maybe 10% of the time I go to bed earlier or later, but I normally go to bed at 11 o'clock. Now let's take a look at our next word, usually. Usually is a very common adverb of frequency and means something happens about 80% of the time. For example, she usually watches TV before bed. This means that about 80% of the time she watches TV before bed. Maybe 20% of the time she does something else, but she usually watches TV before bed. Okay, now let's go down to our next adverb of frequency, often. Often means something happens about 70% of the time. For example, he calls me often. This means that about 70% of the time he calls me. He calls me regularly. He calls me often. Okay, now we're going to get down into adverbs of frequency that describe things that happen less often. For example, our next word is sometimes. Sometimes means something happens about 50% of the time. For example, I ride my bike sometimes. This means that I don't ride my bike a lot, but sometimes I do. I ride my bike sometimes. The next word we're going to look at is the word seldom. Seldom means something happens about 25% of the time, so not very often. For example, she seldom reads. This means that she does not read very much. She seldom reads. Next, let's take a look at a word that's used to describe when things happen about 10% of the time. And that word is rarely. We can use rarely in a sentence like, my friend is rarely late. This means that my friend is only late about 10% of the time. They are not late often. And finally, let's look at the adverb of frequency, never. Never means something happens 0% of the time. It does not happen. For example, I never miss class. This means that 0% of the time I miss class. I never miss class. Next, let's look at some different ways that we can use adverbs of frequency in sentences. We'll talk about 3 main ways that they can be used and one that we'll expand on in a future video. First, we can use adverbs of frequency in sentences that have be plus a verb. Now, if you remember, the verb be includes words like am, is, are, was, and were. For example, I could have a sentence like, my boss is happy. Now, if I want to add an adverb of frequency, I could say, my boss is often happy. As another example, we can look at a sentence like, I'm late for work. Here, I could add an adverb of frequency and say something like, I'm seldom late for work. Next, we can see adverbs of frequency used with other verbs. So we'll see our adverb of frequency plus another verb. For example, I could have a sentence like, we go to Scotland in August. Now, if I want to add my adverb of frequency, I'll put it before that verb and say, we usually go to Scotland in August. As another example, I could look at a sentence like, it gets very windy here. Here our verb is gets, so we want to put our adverb of frequency before, and we could say, it sometimes gets very windy here. Third, it is important to note that most adverbs of frequency can be used at the beginning or the end of a clause or a sentence. For example, I could say, sometimes I want to live somewhere else, or I could put it at the end, and it's also correct. I want to live somewhere else sometimes. Let's look at another example with the adverb usually. Usually I get up early. That is correct. I can also take the adverb usually and put it at the end of that sentence. I get up early usually. That's also correct. Now, we cannot do this with every adverb of frequency. Some adverbs of frequency cannot come at the beginning and the end of sentences. These include the adverbs rarely, seldom, and never. Though it's normally true that never cannot come at the beginning or end of a sentence, always and never can be used at the beginning of imperative sentences. For example, always wear your seatbelt, or never forget it. The last way that we can use adverbs of frequency is a way that we'll expand upon at another time. Here we could use an auxiliary verb and an adverb. For example, I have never seen a whale. You can always stay with us. Or, have you ever played American football? But again, we'll touch on this specific use of adverbs of frequency at another time. Okay, now I want you to try to make your own sentence using adverbs of frequency. I will ask you a question. Think about it and try to answer it, and pause the video to say the sentence out loud. Then, hit play and we'll see what an example of a correct answer would be. Okay, number 1. How often do you read books? Okay, did you come up with your answer? We can answer this question using any adverb of frequency. For example, I sometimes read books, or I read books often. Okay, number 2. How often do you listen to music? Again, we can answer this question using any adverb of frequency. For example, I rarely listen to music, or I listen to music sometimes. Okay, number 3, our last question. How often do you study English? Here, again, we can just plug in our adverb of frequency before the verb and some of them at the beginning or end of a sentence. For example, I always study English, or sometimes I study English. Okay, students, that's it for today's lesson about adverbs of frequency. Please make sure to like and share this video and hit that subscribe button for more English learning videos from our team of real English teachers. See you next time.